Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the webinar on annual requirements, testing your program internal audits and management review. My name is Leanne Chuboff, and I will be your host today, along with Martin Fowle, who is our guest presenter with Mérieux NutriSciences. So we're happy to have everybody here today. So as I said, my name is Leanne Chuboff. I'm the Vice President of Technical Affairs at SQFI. I oversee the SQF program, the codes, the certification bodies, accreditation bodies, training centers, etc. And joining me today is Martin Fowle, Mérieux NutriSciences. He's the Director of Auditing Operations. Martin has been with Mérieux for 23 years, so over half his life is with Mérieux NutriSciences, and we're happy to have you. Welcome, Martin.
Great to be here, Leanne. Excited to hopefully help out and be able to provide some good insight.
Yes, Martin is one of our favorite people of all of within the SQF program. He's one of our favorite auditors, and he's going to be sharing a lot of great stories and insights today. So what will we be discussing? Today's discussion is focused on the annual testing requirements that everybody has to go through. So testing on food defense, on recalls and crisis management, everything, along with the reviews that has to be done. So management reviews, just looking at complaints, all of the reviews that you have to do. So we're going to talk about annual testing requirements, a little bit about test and reviews. We do want to focus on internal audits because, again, this is where some of those issues rise when internal audits aren't done correctly, and then management reviews. So those are some of the areas of opportunities we see as it relates to SQF and in our report reviews. So Martin will be sharing some of those tips that he sees on his auditing adventures. So SQF, before we begin, I do have to share our antitrust statement. We're a collective mind of like bodies from different organizations. So SQF follows the FMI antitrust statement. And before we begin, we want to take a moment to review this antitrust statement that's in front of you and remind everybody that conversations regarding price fixing, boycotting, trade restrictions, or other violations of antitrust law are to be avoided. So if you believe that the conversation is in violation of the antitrust law, please speak up and we will do the same. The good news is that food safety is a non-competitive topic. So typically we're not going to be heading into that antitrust area. So, but please don't let this discourage you from asking any questions and chatting them in the Q&A, because we're going to get to those at the end. So feel free to go ahead and just chat them in there. So a little bit about Mérieux. Martin, you want to take this slide?
Yeah, yep. So, Mérieux NutriSciences, we're a global country. We have subsidiaries all over the world, really. But we offer a wide range of food safety solutions. Most people are very familiar with our laboratories. We do analytical testing. We have consulting services, training services, labeling, research support, sensory studies, a little bit of everything. The way we're organized is the auditing group is a separate part of the company. So from an accreditation standpoint, what I generally say is I can answer the auditing questions. I'm very familiar with those. When it gets into the other side of the business, definitely feel free to reach out to us and we'll point you in the right direction for the right people.
Yes, great. Thank you. All righty, so we're going to begin all our discussions on the annual testing requirements. So just to kind of introduce and lay the framework, this is really where what you have to do every year, annual testing that's required for traceability, for the recall, crisis management, food defense, looking at your backflow systems. So, what can be done there. water test for potability and ensuring that water test is conducted every year, and compressed air testing. That's also another challenge when it comes to the systems. And then if you're looking at quality, including yeast and mold as well, to ensure that that's not going to recontaminate the product. And that's versus just your actual to-do list, which includes your management review or your proficiency testing when it comes to evaluating your on-site testing methods, not just whether you have a lab or not, but if you're doing any food safety testing, ensuring that those testing methods are going to give you the results that should be expected. Food safety plan, your HACCP plan, internal audits. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of those internal audits and what the results you need to get. Product recall, the entire plan, the crisis management plan, food defense plan, and food fraud plan. So all of those are your tests versus the to-do list, your reviews in a sense. But I'm curious on this slide, Martin, I don't have validation. So where would validation go? Is that an annual test or is that a to-do?
So, I would have to say, Leanne, I would probably put it into both categories. So I would expect as an auditor that at least once a year, you're going to review the validation information that you have, really to verify that nothing has changed, that you're still following the same systems, the same processes. And when you find there is a change, then I would expect that an actual test be conducted to validate the system. There's lots of examples in industry of things that have happened because of lack of validation. I would probably use the example of an oven. So if you're cooking a product, it's going through an oven. If you make any changes to, replacing a motor, changing the belt speed, changing the length of the belt, things like that, any of those changes would require another test of the system, another validation. And at least once a year, just really evaluating your processes to make sure that there haven't been any of those changes.
So even if it's just a new motor, it's the same motor, but they upgraded or updated, then it would have to be not just a whole new oven. So even if you're replacing a belt, are you saying?
So I would say if it's a change to anything that could affect the function of that device,
Right.
that there would be another validation conducted for it.
Oh,
And it could be, it may seem similar. You're buying, maybe you think it's going to be the same oven. It looks like the same size. It looks like the same brand, but you're putting it into a different room that has different air handling systems, different risks that way. So I
right.
really think the review would be the first part of it, checking, saying, hey, is there anything that's different? And then based upon that, doing the
Right.
test to really validate that it is getting the job done.
Wow. Yeah. Because I had a question earlier, somebody had posed to me regarding actual doing validation studies like for cleaning and sanitation for allergen control. So do you like for things like that, or even just basic sanitation, ensuring that you have you're going to be able to clean and sanitize appropriately. Are you introducing that allergen or the specific pathogen? How do you conduct that validation test to try and avoid contaminating, you're introducing a contaminate into your system?
Yeah, no, definitely, doing a validation for sanitation, that would be one I would probably put into that annual requirement. Um, as definitely a good practice, if nothing else. Partly because a lot of times there are a lot of changes in the sanitation team. It's not an easy shift. I might be working third shift, and a lot of those people are probably going to get promoted, hopefully, if they're good at their job. And so you tend to have a lot of turnover in those positions, which is why I think doing that annual validation to make sure they're still using the same chemicals, the water temperature is still the same, the processes they're following is the same. So I think doing that testing on an annual basis is pretty important to validate your system's working.
Yeah. And now I want to just quick question about the water test. So where do you see people pulling samples for that water test? for the annual water test?
Yep. So for the water test, pulling the samples definitely should be from where it's actually being used. I think the intent of the code is that you're actually testing the internal water systems. Especially, I'm going to pick a site that's located in a city. The city or the municipality probably has water testing programs in place. So when it gets to your site, there's a pretty high confidence level that it's okay. But once it enters your building, if there's any like dead lines, any, pipes that have been disconnected and, they just kind of provide a harborage, create a potential issue there. Which is why it's important that you're testing the water at the point of use where it's being introduced into the process. The other thing I would add on this one, Leanne, I just thought of this would be the reviewing the results. So I would say several times over the past few years, I've ran into situations as an auditor where they have tested the water, but the results came back positive for coliform, and they filed them, they put them in the binder, but never actually took actions. So, kind of when you're doing these tests, making sure that it's not just doing it to check a box on the SQF code, but you're actually doing it to find out if there's any issues and fix them if there are.
Right. No, that's a good. And same thing with compressed air. So how are you looking at the compressed air system? I mean, are you actually testing the air coming out of the point of use, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, typically I would see the air tested at the point of use.
Okay.
A lot of different methods, ideally it would be a volumetric method where you could collect a certain amount, test it for, whatever indicating organisms you're looking for. But I do see some creative ones too, where sites have kind of come up with other methods, and the importance of, just making sure that what they're doing is valid. Because, once again, if you're going through the process of the test, you really want to find out if you have a problem. You don't want to do it just to say that SQF auditor made me do my compressed air
Right.
testing, so I did it. Here it is. I'm done with it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the theme of this entire webinar is you're doing this to improve your overall, all of your programs. It's not just to get a certificate or because SQF says so, but really we put it in there intentionally because that's how important it is to ensure that these tests are working as designed. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about testing versus review. And what is that big difference between the test and the review?
Yeah, what I usually say is a test is really a challenge. It's something kind of out of the ordinary. What it's not, and I think for testing, it's easier to say what it's not versus what it is sometimes. But a test isn't just reviewing your policy, reading through it, checking records. That's not really testing any systems. So really, a few key parts of doing a test would be to make sure that you're actually picking something that's challenging. Just like Leanne said, we really want this to be something that drives improvement. So we don't want you to pick a scenario that you already know is okay. You're already, you're very strong in that area. So that's why we say be creative, use your imagination, try to think outside of the box and try to think of something that you wouldn't expect to occur, because that's, the point of the test is to be ready when the worst case scenario does happen. From an auditing standpoint or an auditor's perspective, definitely the documentation of the test is going to be very important. With the description, the conditions, what happens, areas that you need to improve, corrective actions. And I think one of the problems we see when we're looking at tests are people tend to just do a desktop exercise. So they all sit in a room, they talk about it. Oh, what would we do? Well, we would do this, we would do that. But what I'd really expect to see for the test is that you've done those steps. So if you're using a cold storage, company for trailers, if you have a power outage, calling up that company and saying, hey, do you have 50 trailers available? Could you have them here in 2 hours? Who would I contact? If I call you at midnight, are you going to be able to answer the phone, or do I need someone else? So really not just sitting in an office and talking about what you would do, but actually going through those steps of the process to test it. And the review is also important. I don't want to, kind of lessen the importance of doing that review. But the test really should be a combination of both, reviewing the program and then making those phone calls, checking to make sure you have the capacity, the ability to execute if a real situation occurs.
One of the challenges that I see, even in specifically to recalls, let's just talk about recalls and testing a recall scenario, is that a site typically will use the easiest scenario. So one of my supplies is contaminated, or metal detect, metal contamination or whatever. But what we're not looking at is the worst case scenario. So I feel that even during some of the recalls that we've seen, is that we're not looking at it, we're not testing it to that level and challenging ourselves at that level. So we're not looking at it from, if there's a crisis in second shift when not very many people, like you said, are awake, or, is somebody going to answer that phone? So I feel like sometimes we lessen it just to make it an easier test for us. I don't know if you're seeing that in some of the examples. And it's not that SQF makes you test the worst case scenario, but sometimes it's just, do you see that it's the same test over and over and over again?
Yeah, no, I definitely do see that because, as a site, I want to be able to show the auditor that I can do it really quickly. I can account for everything. Another good practice I've seen over the years is actually purchasing a product from commerce and then saying, going into the conference room and saying, hey, this product is contaminated. What would we have to do to recall it? Many, many years ago, before I joined Mérieux, I actually worked for a cheese company. And by doing that, what I had done one day is I bought a cup of blue cheese off the shelf in the supermarket, took it and said, okay, if this is contaminated, what would we have to do? When we did that, when we went through that exercise, what we found is that actually the cheese could have come from two different facilities. Each of those facilities had combined dates of VAT. So once we started, we realized that even though on paper it looked simple, we knew when it was crumbled, when we actually got down to the nitty gritty of it, we wouldn't have been able to find everything, and it would have ended up being a recall of everything that we had ever produced. So I think, kind of picking that real life scenario and just, buying a product and saying this product has listeria. What do we do? What would we have to do? I think it can have some valuable lessons.
Right. And then even you could take, like, I mean, let's just say you can take that scenario, that same scenario, and would you be able to like escalate it to a whole nother level? Let's just say the contamination was intentional. Now, can you combine that with your food defense test as well?
I mean, I think that could be a great way to test food defense is to kind of use that scenario and say, okay, would we have caught this? It's going to end up being a little bit more records if you go that route, since you don't have something specific. But I
Right.
definitely think integrating them together is helpful. And I would actually expand that to pretty much anything in your food safety management system.
Yeah.
There's so many links. We were actually just doing an exercise internally for a CPO, and on the call when we were talking about things, someone brought up, they're like, well, if we change it here, though, it's going to change this part of our system and that part of our system. And because everything is so overlapping, I think the more you can integrate, the more you can kind of look at things as a whole, the more effective it's going to be as a test or a review.
Yeah. Now I want to talk a little bit more about that review, specifically management reviews, because I just think that is over it's underwhelming, some of the some of the results we see when it comes to even what auditors look at or what sites do. But what are some of the areas that you look for in a management review when you're auditing, when a site when you say, okay, let me look at your management review for the year? What are you looking for specifically in that?
Yeah. So really what I'm looking for, I think the easiest way to explain it is it's a temperature check or it's a effectiveness check of how their food safety management system has been working over the course of the past year. A lot of times I'll run into situations where a site says, well, we do our management review every week. It's important communication. I agree you have to communicate regularly. When things happen, it's good to, notify people right away. But I really think the intent of the management review is kind of that high level assessment of your systems and saying, hey, has it worked? Every week we have a complaint because there's piece of metal and product. So over the last 52 weeks, we've had 520 complaints. And, every week we hear them, we're like, yeah, we know we always have these. But then turning around and looking back at the last year and saying, wow, we need to we need to invest in new equipment or metal detectors. So I really think a good management review is going to have that trend analysis, and just really analyzing the results of all of that data that you have for the year. Um, what I sometimes see, unfortunately, is a site thinks it's just kind of a check the box. So they have the module 2 requirements, they have module 11, and they just go through and write compliant, compliant,
Oh,
compliant
yeah.
without having the data to say, hey, how do we know that this is working? What's the data? What are our trends and things like that? So I know it's a long answer, but the quick answer, good trend analysis and just looking at the data to see, has your food safety management system been effective is what I look for.
And that's the intent of the review, is to share with senior management so that if any changes need to occur, if we need to hire another person or get a new piece of equipment to address some of these trends. And that's what the power of going to senior management gives you, that opportunity to do that. So it's not just about ticking the box about, yeah, here's but it's providing all that really good information for senior management to have that analysis and decision making.
Yeah. And a good documentation of that is that PowerPoint presentation where you have the graphs, you make it easy for that person who's in charge. Because the other thing I look for is the person who makes the decisions financially is included within that management review. Because really, as a QA manager, what I'm trying to do is convince that person that we need to use our resources to kind of make the improvements we need for food safety. So whoever, I would say the highest level person who makes decisions for budgets should be included in that management review as well.
Is there anything that's typically missing in there? Like, except for, like, you're saying what's good is trend analysis, but like, is anything missing? Like, do people seem to overlook complaints or sanitation issues? Or, I mean, is there one area that's somewhat overlooked?
Yeah, so I think the complaints is usually one that's very well analyzed. I think that's always kind of in the front. I think it's the results of the GMP inspections. I would put that as one where a lot of sites will be doing, USDA site will be doing daily, operational inspections, but there's no analysis of the data or the results from that. So I think if I had to pick one area, I would pick GMP inspections as something that's missing from management review.
Yeah, no, that's a good call out. Thank you. So let's just talk about food defense just a little bit more and look at a scenario and the difference between a test and a review. So here's just a scenario regarding your typical challenge about somebody who, can you enter the building, can you attempt to empty the building? Did they gain entrance, etc.? And what that is. And that's the test of food defense, right? And the challenge there. But the review is more about looking at annually about what you used in order to create your food defense program, the vulnerability assessment. So challenging yourself, did things change? Did we get new uniforms or ID cards? Or is there been a change in the front office? Do we have new policies or procedures, new equipment, new cameras, whatever it might be? Are we looking at a different threat here? So it's looking at that vulnerability assessment. So the test is the actual test of the system. The review is truly looking at the development of that program and the core of it. So whether it's your vulnerability assessment, your threat assessment, whether it's the looking at your hazard analysis, depending on what you're testing, right? So that's really the difference. So Martin, I cannot stand this scenario. It's always used. It's like the number one scenario. It's like the only thing we can think about when it comes to food defense is walking in and did you get through the systems? So what else can people test besides this?
Yeah. So Definitely, I would say as an auditor, I see this all the time. And, once in a while, I think, it's good to do this. But what happens if you're always testing the same part of the system, you're really not getting a good feeling or a good level of confidence that the whole system is working. So for food defense, other things I've seen include breaking a seal on a trailer before it gets to the guard shack or to the door, just to see if the person receiving it is going to flag it, identify it, and say, hey, wait a minute, we have a problem. So that's what I see. Definitely, suspicious packages. Sometimes just putting a package somewhere and seeing how long it takes for someone to report that and bring it up. Um, those are both examples I've seen that are good. Um, you know, s- I've had I've seen a situation, and it's you know, where basically a site had received a call from someone, and this wasn't a test, but the person said they had contaminated a tanker. And so it caused them to say, hey, what do we need to do? Who do we call? Do we call the FDA? Do we call the local police? And so I think just, all those different things that could happen, using different scenarios at least every year. If you're only doing it once a year, a different scenario every year to really test the full system.
So that just an example came to my mind about where you think a test and what could be identified. When I used to work for the Restaurant Association, when food defense first started being a program that needed to be implemented, a restaurant was doing a mock test of their food defense program, and they had arranged it with 911. They were going to call 911 and phone in, I think it was white powder, like suspicious white powder at the restaurant. That's when the white powder incidences were really big. And they had it all planned out with 911, and so that wasn't the issue. What they didn't realize is that there are people that monitor the 911 channels, and so 911 knew it was a test, but people that were monitoring the 911 channels didn't, and it went to the news. So this mock scenario, they were treating it like a real scenario, and it went to the news and it became newsworthy, like this restaurant has white powder, they've been contaminated. And so it's just, they were like, that identified, we didn't realize that other people were hitting up those channels. And then all of a sudden this became news before, not just because it wasn't news, but they weren't controlling that message. So the test, when you're testing it to the worst case scenario, when you're testing it to that level, I think it does identify, and you challenge yourself, it does identify other vulnerabilities within the system itself. So yeah,
Yeah.
no,
And
those
it
are
might,
examples.
I'm jumping a little ahead, Leanne, but that actually might result in a crisis test too then.
Oh yeah, right. There
So
you
we link
go.
it together.
Now you could do two tests with one. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Uh-huh. Good point. So here's some data for you. Everybody likes the data, but these are the non-conformances with annual program. This is data from a couple years ago, but it really probably hasn't changed much. When you look at the top program test requirements for traceability, recall, crisis management, and food defense, you see there's a lot of majors, just because in traceability, for not tracking ingredients. So the ingredients, specifically food packaging, is not being tracked. Product recall, or for crisis management, the lack of testing, for food defense, and again, lack of that challenge. So that's where we're seeing most of our non-conformances. So what do you think, Martin? Are you seeing anything different? This is where you're seeing some of the key failures are when you're reviewing these types of programs?
Yeah, no, looking at the numbers here, I feel like it probably is still pretty accurate and consistent with what I see as an auditor. I think the traceability, people just miss things. They change an ingredient, they change a form, and they lose that traceability. And then definitely the lack of testing. And I'm afraid auditors probably don't score it as often as they should. But I think sometimes auditors will accept a review instead of a test, which isn't okay. That's something, we're really working with the auditors to kind of put the onus back to the site to really test the system and not just do a desktop review without anything else included.
What So, what's the difference then between the traceability and the recall? Do you see those being done together, or what do you
Yeah. So
think?
I'm gonna be honest, as an auditor, I've probably gotten a little lax in this area myself. What I always say
Right.
is traceability is what we traceability is what we do as an auditor during the audit, where we're just checking to make sure that you have records, picking a product, can you tell us where it came from, how much was produced, where it shipped to? If you're really doing a true mock recall, you're going to be testing the rest of the system. So kind of going back to that contact list, is it current? Are these people the people who I would need to get a hold of? If your recall program says you're going to bring all the product back on site, do you have the capacity to hold that product? Do you have the ability to, segregate it in your systems? And so what I would say, traceability is just, can I track it one step forward, one step back? Do I know the lot codes of everything? Product recall test would be that whole system. Everything that's in there, are you testing it? Are you making sure that if it happens, knock on wood, hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, that you're ready and able to perform.
Yeah, no, that
Yep.
makes sense. So let's talk about another test, which is crisis management. So crisis management, when you look at the basic steps of crisis management, the goal is prevention. So you want to put forth the plan, or put not just the plan to address the crisis, but what you're doing to prevent. So that's what your HACCP plan is for. That's what your vulnerability assessment, your threat assessment, that's what all of that is for. So the prevention is really what is the key to that. But of course, the time to plan is before the crisis. So the preparation. So, looking at the different risks, what are some of those red flags, and how to prepare to execute the crisis, and then what's your response plan. So how do you going to respond to that, and then the recovery, and transitioning back to normal. But why don't you walk us through, Martin, the crisis threat, like a typical crisis management test.
Yeah, yep. So when you sent over the slides to me, Leanne, I have to be honest, I never even thought about that top one with a supplier or a product that's single sourced. Um, I mean, I never thought about that, but that could be a huge risk if you're the only one who's making a certain product, or if you have one supplier who's, that's all you have to choose from. So I think, from the test standpoint, is really just thinking about what could happen. What is reasonably likely, kind of like food safety, similar thought process of what should I expect to occur. Definitely we see the natural disasters, the flooding, the hurricanes, things like that. Um, you know, all of these could be crisis situations. So typically we start with identifying, what is going to be this test? What are we going to say happened? And then once again, kind of like we were saying before, is try to get away from it just being a group of people in a room talking about what they would do, and try to incorporate as much of the actual tasks as possible. Contacting, I can't stress enough how important it is to make sure that you're able to get refrigeration if the power is out, that you're able to move product. I had one site where during their crisis management program, they realized that their dock plates were electronic or needed power to operate. So if there was a power outage, they wouldn't be able to get the product from the warehouse onto a trailer because they didn't have any of the old manual dock plates. So, it's just little things like that where until the situation actually occurs, a lot of people, and I mean, like I said, I wouldn't have thought about something like that either. So, just really, like I said, as many of the tasks as possible. Definitely, document everything. Document when you did it, the time, who you would have contacted, and then finally do the corrective actions and make sure that if there are any issues identified where you may have a weakness, that you've improved and gotten a corrective action to cover it.
Yeah, we had one site, it was during a hurricane, and none of their surrounding sites had any water. but they didn't worry about it because they had already pre-ordered a tanker of water, and they were able to continue their operations because they had fresh potable water, and everybody else was, just didn't have the ability to do that. So, and it was like a convenience store operation. They were able to supply all their convenience stores with fresh potable water, but they had planned that years ago, just in their crisis management preparation, and they were able to, ensure that they had everything in place. So whether it's ensuring you have a generator or a tanker of water or whatever it might be, doing that true assessment of what those vulnerabilities are is really going to provide you with the action plan that you need. But yeah, but keeping it, I can't emphasize enough in testing it to the worst case scenario. So it's true, it's looking at what are some of those vulnerabilities that you have. If you're that single source for one particular ingredient or one product, to a supplier or a retailer, then making sure that you have the right, the right actions in place in order to mitigate that risk. So yeah, excellent. Okay, so now we're going to shift to internal audits, and this is one of my favorite slides. This is, so Tammy Van Buren, I'm sure many of you have heard her on a number of webinars. She usually does these, but I gave her a break today, and I thought, oh, I'll try, I'll do this with Martin over here. So, but this is the data this is the kind of data and her thought process, and this just demonstrates the importance of an internal audit. So she looked at, this data is, again, I probably from, I don't know, 2023, middle of 2023, but she looked at the total number of nonconformances to edition 9 as it relates to the internal audit. And she saw that there was over 2,000 minors and 90 majors. And so she looked at this data and she correlated it to the average score of results. So if a site received minor, so the average score of all the sites is like a 94. Everybody knows that. If a site with a minor nonconformance received, what was their score with a minor nonconformance to an internal audit? So it was 4 points less. If the site received a minor nonconformance on internal audits, it was 4 points less. If they received a major nonconformance, it was almost 15 points less. And that's the difference between an effective internal audit program and the result of what I think most people are very concerned about is the final score, the overall score. Now, Martin, does this ring true to you? Like if you're looking at an internal audit, is that like one of the first things you're looking at and you're like, oh, this is going to be a good audit, or, oh, this is going to be not a very good audit? Like, do you see that?
So I mean, first of all, this slide, I mean, it says so much just about the importance of internal audits. So I really, really appreciate that. As an auditor, I tend to look at the internal audit last because then I've had a chance to kind of assess the programs to understand kind of where the site's at, where their weaknesses and strengths may be. But then if I look at their internal audit and, during my audit, I found 15 items, all things that should have been caught. And I look at their internal audit and they gave themselves 100. It's a big red flag to me that, hey, this internal audit really wasn't an internal audit. It was just a pat ourselves on the back kind of situation. And what I find is if I do look at an internal audit and the site has been very tough on themselves, where they've really done a good job, they've dug into things, they've identified issues, I tend to find fewer nonconformances during my audit just because the site has that process in place to fix them and to correct things. I always say we know things are going to happen. That's why, we have to audit. That's why we have systems in place. And I think the more items you can identify internally before your external auditor gets there, the better off you're going to be and the higher score you're going to have in that audit.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, is looking at it, because you're not, if you review it at the end, you're right, then you're looking at it objectively. Also, you're not going to penalize the site for the issues that they've identified. They just need, because you're assuming then they closed them out, corrected them, and you didn't see them, right? So it's
Yep.
not a penalty, so it's not a penalty, which is why a site needs to do that very robust audit, internal audit.
Yeah.
So some do's and don'ts. This is kind of what I came up with, but make sure you use a checklist. These would be our recommendations, that you would report all the issues that you see, and ensure you close them out. And the big issues that we see is the practitioner always does it, is responsible for it, closing it out, maintaining it, etc. And then it's usually just a GMP audit, and it's not truly an internal audit. What are some of the good things, and share with us the good, the bad, and the ugly that you see with the internal audit program?
Yep. So one of the weaknesses I generally see is the lack of objective evidence for compliance. So a lot of times it's just the word compliant or yes, things like that, without really giving me details about what was looked at, what was reviewed. So I would say something that would be a good would be including specific details of compliance within your internal audit. It's helpful for yourself because that way you know what you looked for. It's also helpful during the audit because if the auditor is asking you a question about specifications and you're having a hard time understanding maybe what they're looking for, you can just open up your internal audit, especially if you've done it against the SQF code, and just see what your notes were and say, oh, this is our policy for it. Here's what we looked at. Here's how we handled it, just to kind of make it a little bit easier because auditors sometimes use different lingo, different words to ask for things. So I think just having that information with good objective evidence is very helpful. The other thing, and Leanne said it, was a lot of times we see that when people think of an audit, they think it's just an inspection, but it really should be an assessment of the policies, procedures, records, interviewing employees, doing the physical inspection, obviously. And the way I usually describe it is you should be doing what a third-party auditor does, just doing it for yourself, having that same level of formality, have an opening meeting, let everyone know how the process is going to go, have an audit plan. And it's very hard, as a certification body, we're audited by the CPOs, by, our accreditation body and different organizations. And when I was certification manager, I always found it really hard to set aside the time and do a good internal audit because I'm always in a hurry. I'm always, I'm like, oh, I'll start working on it and then I'll go do something else. But if you can really like set aside the time, say, you know what, these 2 days, all I'm going to do is an internal audit. I'm going to put on my out of office. I'm going to act like I'm a third party auditor coming in and doing this assessment. I think you're going to have a better result. I think it's going to have that focus and just the level of detail that you need.
Yeah. And I think too, I think the biggest pitfall that I see is also that the practitioner is the only one that does it. So I don't feel like you really get that objectiveness sometimes, like you just, only because if I do it every year, if I do this, then I already know what I'm looking for. So even at SQF, we do an internal audit of our program, and we used somebody on our business development team, and they, very responsible and, are knowledgeable about SQF and food safety and all of that. So we were very fortunate to have that person. But they provided us with a really good perspective from their perspective. So I just think using somebody different, training them up into that role can also help you just get a different perspective. Do you see the same person doing the internal audit every year?
Yeah, unfortunately I do. And I think you're totally right. It's just a different set of eyes sometimes can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So alrighty, so we're done with our slides. So hopefully you all have questions, and we're going to get to those in just a second. But here's what Martin and I decided that you all should take away. And I don't know, Martin, if you have any other key takeaways to add, but number one, make sure you treat the test to make your program better, not just to pass the audit. So a lot of times we just, like the food defense challenge, it's always, can I get into the building? But look at what your worst, case scenario is, and be creative and test your system to that worst case scenario. So if you are the single sourced supplier, or if you think, food defense is one of your biggest vulnerabilities, and it's really, or where you think there could be a potential weakness in the system, but be creative and test your system to that worst case scenario, because the ultimate goal is continuous improvement of your program. So a lot of times we get stagnant. There's another slide that I'd love to share, but I don't have it here. It's just when a recall could occur. And actually you look at those recalls, the average day from a recall to the audit was like 270 days. So I think over time we become a little complacent. So the tests are your opportunity to truly drive for continuous improvement. So those are our 3 key takeaways. But before we get to Q&A, I just want to share with you, hopefully you'll be coming to SQF Unites. Registration is open. SQF Unites is March 2nd through the 5th at the Hyatt Regency in Orlando. So that is the link to registration. And if you're looking for more training, internal audit, I know we were just talking about getting new people trained up into the internal audit, role. So we have internal audit training, we have food defense, all of these scenarios right in our online training portal. So go right on sqfi.com under training, and a list of all of our online training that we have available. And with that, we want to say thank you. And if you have any questions, technical questions, go to compliance@sqfi.com. So feel free to do that. And I didn't put your email on there, Martin, so you could always put it in the chat. Or what is it? Do you have it, Mary? You have a generic email?
Yep, I'll put it in the chat. It's
Okay.
just my name. Yep.
Perfect. That's wonderful. And so we want to get to your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can get to your questions. I know that there were a few in there. Let me just open them up. Hold on. I know. Could put them in the chat with me. Okay. Number one, if we are unable to track a specific lot of food contact film, is that a non-conformance? It's food contact film. So if the site is unable to track a specific lot of food contact film, they want to know, is that a non-conformance right away? Or if we go through corrective action, will it be okay? So if they found the issue versus the auditor, I think that's kind of what they're looking for.
Yeah, yep. I would say if you found the issue before the auditor was there, you've implemented an effective corrective action and you can demonstrate that it's under control, everything is being tracked, then I would not expect the auditor to score a separate nonconformance. I always caution when I say that though, you can't do that for everything. So if you did a really good internal audit the week before the auditor got there and found 100 different things, just because you found them and said you fixed them doesn't necessarily let you off the hook for everything. But like I said, we know things are going to happen. And that's the intent of the internal audit, is for you to identify it, fix it, and drive that continuous improvement. So I wouldn't expect an auditor to score it.
Yeah.
If you've corrected it.
Yeah, good. What about, so question on traceability. Traceability is always related with product recalls. Can the site do traceability while doing the internal audit?
So I think that would be a good way to test your traceability system as part of your internal audit, just like hopefully the third-party auditors are also, kind of doing that test during the audit. So I would say yes, definitely. It's a
Yeah.
good idea.
I think honestly, just like you said, when you brought in that container of blue cheese and you're like, okay, what if this is contaminated? That's going to start so many series of questions. And I think an internal audit, you can do a full, just by doing your internal audit, a traceability, I don't know, so full traceability exercise. And if you pick that lot code and you're like, okay, this is the day I'm going to look at training records. This is who was working on the line, where all those people trained, what was the sanitation and the GMP checks, everything that day, just by pulling that one lot code, like a true trace back exercise as it relates to everything that touched that product. That's, I think, could make a really good internal audit.
Yeah, I agree. Just linking it together, same, add in there the suppliers, who supplied the cheese, who supplied the packaging, do we have the records, and just integrating everything into that would, yeah, that would make a great internal audit.
Right. And because I think then it brings it reality, right? That's the product we're selling and people are eating, and the touch points of that particular product just brings it real, brings it to home right there. It touches all those points. So I think that's a really good idea. Question: if we are aware that part of the traceability is lost during the process, can the issue be covered by a risk analysis? So I'm not quite sure what that question is. So if they're aware that part of the traceability is lost during the process, can the issue be covered by a risk analysis?
So it's hard to answer without really kind of understanding and having a little bit more context to it. Um, but there are certain situations where traceability may get like commingled, I always say. So you kind of know, but you don't really know, it's part of this bigger piece. And sometimes it, depending on the industry, the processes, sometimes there are different methods of traceability that aren't quite as effective, I would say, but still work for that industry.
So what if the operation is very small and they're the only food safety, personnel? How do they do an internal audit program?
So I like the idea of doing like a team audit approach in that type of situation. Definitely if you could have at least one other person trained in auditing procedures, then you could be the food safety person. Also, consultants sometimes, you could have outside help come in and help with it as well. But I really think just that second set of eyes, like, Leanne said earlier, having a business development person check some programs, they can say, okay, does this program make sense? Talk to the employees. Do the employees give them the same information? Check the records, make sure the records are okay, and still do, I think, an effective internal audit as long as they understand the auditing process.
Yeah, one of the other pitfalls that I see in an internal audit is that internal auditors never involve the frontline employees. So when you as an auditor are asking an interviewing an employee as part of the SQF audit, sometimes they are nervous and scared because nobody's ever asked them any questions,
Definitely.
Yeah, and make sure you involve everybody. So as a small company with a single practitioner, I find it difficult to spend as much focused time with other members of management to get them involved with the GMP inspection audit. Do you have any advice how to get them more engaged?
I think just kind of showing them what happens. I hate to say it, but sometimes just learning from other people's problems can be helpful. I know that's what I try to do with the auditing team is when we see something happen, we share that with everyone and say, hey, here's something to look out for. And I think just understanding the impact of what we do. I often say if you're working in a factory, those cookies or buns, whatever you're making, eventually it's just widgets going down a line. But the more you can kind of reinforce that, hey, this is food safety, this is why it's important, and just use real life examples, hopefully that helps get buy-in from the rest of the team.
Yeah, and I think also sharing some of the stories that you hear like through food safety news and if this was us, what would we do, kind of things, and that type of information. But if anybody in the chat has ideas, feel free to chat them in to help them out. Yeah.
So
Somebody
some
asked, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
so I've seen some incentive programs where people like employees are encouraged to report GMP type violations, equipment violations. And then at the end of the month, they, draw 5 people's names out and they all get, a $10 gift card or things
Oh,
like that, where you're kind of incentivizing the frontline staff to identify problems that are GMP related as well.
yeah, no, that's a good idea. Yeah. Somebody asked if we had a checklist that they could use and to help with their internal audit, and we do on our website. It's It's in Excel and it's the code. So you could just go ahead and use actually the same checklist that the auditors use. So another question about management review. We currently hold a monthly meeting reviewing several areas of our program. An auditor recently suggested doing the management review once per year, reviewing the prior year's trending data for the food safety program. Is this correct? It's kind of similar what you suggested. Yeah.
So hopefully the auditors don't suggest. If it's our auditor, let me know. Because I think it is important to have that regular communication. And so once again, this is just my personal opinion, but I think in a well-implemented food safety management system, there's going to be several levels of communications. So you may have every shift, you might have a handoff from one shift to the other, just a quick board where you say, hey, here's the problems I had last night. Then maybe a weekly meeting, the next group of people. Monthly, you may review complaints and some items. But I would say at least once a year, taking a step back and looking at all of the data, looking at all the trend analysis, what's been happening, because I think that's really important. Otherwise, I'm horrible with phrases, but you'll miss the forest for the trees or trees,
Yeah.
so so it's kind of that same concept as if every day I'm hearing the same thing, eventually it just becomes an annoyance. But if once a year I look back and I say, oh, wow, this is what happened, this is where our trends were, then I think it's a little bit more impactful.
And I will honestly say, I use AI like Chat GPT and, whatever Charm or whatever it might be. There's a new one, Charm IQ, and all that kind of stuff that's out there. I use it all the time. So I think if you need help summarizing anything or how to talk to senior management or whatever, you can put that into those types of programs and it'll provide you with some guidance. It'll provide you with at least get you started on those types of reviews. I don't know if you see sites using those now, but I just in my head, I'd be like, I'd totally pop that into a AI enabled tool.
So I'm very old fashioned, so I haven't used it myself. But just the meeting we had not too long ago, where you had done that with the problem statement, I think it's a great tool. If it just, I always say sometimes the hardest part is just getting started. I find that with myself all the time. It's like I have a task to do, and it takes me 2 days to just kind of figure out those first couple paragraphs. But then once I get that started, I can adjust it, I can change it. And I think using AI just to start the process is very, very invaluable.
Yeah. Okay, question. We have about 3 more minutes and about 20 more questions, so we're not obviously going to get to them all. Question on proficiency testing. Do you have a quick answer on what is acceptable by auditors?
So it's all going to depend on the type of test that's being done. What I always say is we want the proficiency to ensure that you're getting valid test results. So ideally, it would be testing the whole system from the sampling point through the result.
Yeah.
I know it's not a very good answer, but
Yeah, no, that's good. What about food safety culture? Management review, is there a test? Are we testing food safety culture? Is that management review, annual survey? What are some annual verification ideas?
yeah. Food safety culture is huge and it's hard to quantify. As an auditor, it's probably one of my least favorite questions, just because when I'm done with the audit, I either know or don't know, but it's hard for me to quantify that, hey, this is what's good. I think the surveys are valuable because that way you're getting that input directly from the frontline workers. But I also think just the trends on how things are going, the communication, it's just so multifaceted that it's hard to give one answer for something that would work for everyone.
Yeah. Okay, another question on testing swabs. If you're using swabs to test for allergens in line and EMPs, color change, salmonella, and listeria swabs, what kind of allergen validation testing should be conducted for those swabs or the process itself? Does that?
So I'm not a lab person. My background's not really in laboratories. Um, but I always take it back to making sure that the test is going to find a problem if it's there. So if you're using a swab that's not going to actually identify allergens that are there, if you're using a color change swab that might be misinterpreted, then that's where I would have concerns as an auditor is just, are those results really valid?
Yeah, yeah, no. And if I know, like, neither one of us are, swab experts, but you happen to work for a company that is an expert in swab. So honestly, you could just go back to a testing company like Mérieux and get some advice that way, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. My email's in the chat, so definitely feel free to copy it down and reach out directly.
Right.
I
And
can put
then,
you in touch with the right people.
yeah, right. I was going to say he knows people there. Yeah. Is a risk assessment is a risk assessment a completely separate thing? How can you cover the traceability issue with it? I'm not quite sure. I think that was a follow-up question to something about a risk assessment. Yeah.
So I think I just, that second question actually maybe helped clarify a little bit about what they might be asking.
Yeah.
There is a clause in SQF that allows for alternative controls to be implemented. Um, so a risk assessment, I say, can be used to kind of help demonstrate how you're controlling other risks, but that might be something to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, it's 1 o'clock, and honestly, there's probably about 10 more questions left. So unfortunately, won't be able to get to them all. But we do appreciate, again, you have my contact information in there. You have Martin's contact information in there. So feel free to take your question and send it to us, and we'll get back to you, or make sure we have the right people get back to you. But thank you for joining us today, Martin. Thank you for all your insights. This was a fabulous conversation as always. So thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge in this webinar. And that's it from SQF. I hope you can join us for another 365 digital webinar where we love hosting these. So hope everybody has a great day. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.